I recently made a video discussing how Artorias from Dark Souls 1 fighting Melania from Elden Ring is actually a closer fight than some people may think, and the video had just reached 1,000 views on YouTube, so let me thank you all for that. I really appreciate that a lot again. With that video, I actually got a request over on my YouTube comment section to do a follow-up video pinning the Burnt Ivory King against Artorias the Abysswalker. The only problem was that I have actually never played Dark Souls 2 in my life and only knew the Burnt Ivory King by only his name because he wasn't in Dark Souls 1, Elden Ring, or Night Rain. So it was a process of elimination thing. So I spent my first half of my day sleeping on Dark Souls 2, and then the second half of my day thoroughly researching the Burnt Ivory King and his fate. And what I realized is that Ivory King may be a woman under the helmet thanks to an investigation from Zuli the Witch. When it comes to Artorias and the Ivory King, though, they both seem to have suffered very similar fates, facing off against forces of insurmountable power and losing themselves in the end. But when it comes down to who would win in an actual fight, I'm going to put my 2 cents forward here and tell you how Artorias versus the Burnt Ivory King may actually be closer than you think. Some rules I would like to establish is what versions of the two characters I will be discussing, in which I have chosen Artorias consumed by the Abyss and the Burnt Ivory King consumed by the Chaos Flame. And the reason for this is actually because of the mental capabilities each opponent may have during the fight, as they are both afflicted by a sort of unbridled power in one way or another. The Chaos Flame created by the Witches of Izalith seems to consume the body, mind, and soul as stated by the item description of the Charred Lois set, just like the Abyss does. If you look at the soul of the Burnt Ivory King here and compare it to the soul of the Bed of Chaos from Dark Souls 1, as well as the soul of the Demon Prince in Dark Souls 3, it is clear to see the Flame of Chaos and its influence on the soul of each of these beings. And to back up the claim that this same thing happens to Artorias and other creatures with the Abyss, and how it affects the mind and body, we can see the effects clearly on the Ulusil residents and Artorias, but when it comes to the soul, that needs a little bit of more evidence. And I believe it exists in Dark Souls 1. First, to prove that is by looking at the item description of the Abyss Greatsword obtained from Artorias' soul after defeating him, which describes that, swallowed by the dark with his master, this sword is tainted by the Abyss. And then looking at the Greatsword of Artorias, obtained from Sif's soul after defeating her, which is clearly a version of Artorias' sword that is unaffected by the Abyss in his defeat. It's clearly like a reflection of his soul before it was consumed by the Abyss. You have an Abyss Greatsword, and then you have the Greatsword of Artorias. And so if both Artorias and the Burnt Ivory King's body, mind, and soul are corrupted, I believe that there's not really any reason to look beyond that, such as trying to look into the extent of how long they've been corrupted by Chaos and the Abyss, but instead it would be much more beneficial to look at their skills and abilities despite being in their corrupted state, in which there would be one specific advantage that the Burnt Ivory King has against Artorias, and one specific advantage that Artorias has against the Burnt Ivory King, and one disadvantage one of them has against the other. To address the advantage that the Burnt Ivory King has against Artorias is to pit his background to Artorias' own background. Despite Artorias and the Burnt Ivory King having both been the highest ranking knights in their own respective kingdoms, it is important to note that while Artorias was one of 4 of Gwyn's personally appointed knights during an era that mostly consisted of peace, at least in Anor Londo, the city of the gods, where Gwyn and his army resided in, for the most part including Artorias until he was dispatched to Ulusil anyways. So it is during this time that we could safely assume that Artorias, despite being in league with other 3 knights, personally appointed by Gwyn, it seems his role as a knight was to specifically fight against the Abyss, as he could naturally traverse the Abyss, as stated by the Covenant of Artorias, and even his greatsword states that his sword was specifically meant to slay dark wraiths, as his sword strikes harder against dark servants. And so, even after Artorias is corrupted by the Abyss, he continues to fight servants of the dark, as shown in his boss room cutscene, But that is unfortunately here where that's just all of his experience as a warrior sort of ends. It ends here, in which he lived a mostly peaceful era. And he's skilled solely on the basis of fighting servants of the dark, the Abyss. But as for the experiences of the Burnt Ivory King goes, his Ultra Greatsword states that he was once the highest ranking knight in his home of Ferosa, famed by its god of war. And the reason this is important is because Ferosa, for the entirety of its existence, from its establishment to its collapse, was in a constant state of war, as stated by an NPC called Vengrel of Ferosa, and I quote, "I was born in Ferosa, it's a land in the distant east. When I was born, we were already mired in prolonged conflict with our neighbors," meaning that even before this guy was born, they were always at war with others. And while the Burnt Ivory King was the highest ranking knight of Ferosa, it could be safely assumed that he has a much more vast experience in combat than Artorias has ever had because of this era of war. Despite this combat experience and overall advantage, I believe that the Burnt Ivory King has over Artorias, that Artorias stands a greater chance against the Burnt Ivory King due to his one advantage that I will clarify now, and one disadvantage that I'm still going to keep hidden for now, that the Burnt Ivory King has. As for Artorias' advantage, it would have to be the fact that him being consumed by the Abyss has granted it some abilities in Dark Souls, while the Burnt Ivory King being consumed by the Chaos Flame has not granted him any extra abilities. For example, in Dark Souls 1, Artorias uses his broken arm to fling dark magic sludge at the player if they manage to get behind him. Artorias also, of course, has his power-up move, in which he is much more aggressive, faster, and stronger. If we take into account of the Night Rain variation of Artorias, in which his power boost also grants him the ability to spawn in Heat-Seeking Humanities when he does, I believe that his power-up from the Abyss will help him have a much greater chance defeating the Burnt Ivory King, especially when the Burnt Ivory King, his most significant disadvantage is the fact that he's old. As stated by Alsana, by the time the Burnt Ivory King had decided to enter Old Chaos, his vigor had already managed to have mostly been drained already. Not only this, but when we add to the fact that so much time has passed, that his soul had been corrupted, the gates of his kingdom had been opened, and for that same kingdom to be frozen solid, I have no doubt that it is with this age and the fact that the Burnt Ivory King is also most likely always burning in agony alongside his knights, as stated by the Charred voice set, means that he has certainly grown weaker since his prime kingly days, since before he stepped down from the throne and entered Old Chaos. I also didn't forget about the Burnt Ivory King's second phase, where he uses magic to extend the range of his Ultra Greatsword, as well as giving it the ability to create ice spikes from the ground. And while this would certainly prove to be more of a useful defense against any of the dark magic that Artorias may use against the Burnt Ivory King, I can't imagine any offensive use for it, because Artorias, since he's so corrupted, he'll be on the constant attack, unless he's powering up. I think the fight could go either way, with me personally thinking that despite his old age and lack of buffs from the Chaos Flame, the Burnt Ivory King certainly beats Artorias, but at the very least, the fight is certainly much closer than you probably thought.